Okay, so AI chat platforms, right? They're everywhere. ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. I mean, they're like part of life now for a lot of us.
Yeah, totally. Like using them every day for stuff.
Exactly. And it's easy to get caught up in what they can do. But what's really fascinating is how they're affecting us, like emotionally, our behaviors. That's what we're going deep on today.
That deeper level, right? You might be using them for work, drafting a document or whatever. But there's this whole other layer of emotional stuff going on underneath. And that's what we're calling affective use. When it's not just about the information, it's about like emotional needs or psychological stuff driving how we use these chatbots.
And we've got a super interesting study to guide us here. It's called, OpenAI Effective-Use-Study.pds. And one of the things that really stood out to me was their approach. It wasn't just like one way of looking at it. They combined this huge analysis of like real world ChatGPT data, how people are actually using it.
Right.
And then they did this really well designed RCT, a randomized controlled trial.
Yeah, that's a really smart way to do it, combining those methods, because you get like the real world and then you get the controlled experiment.
Exactly. So we're going to try to unpack all of this for you today. First, we've got to understand like what exactly is effective use? And how do you even measure something like that? It's pretty subtle.
Yeah. So effective use, we've kind of touched on it, but it's basically when people are using these AI chatbots, not just for facts or tasks, but because of some emotional or psychological need.
Right.
Like they might be looking for empathy or trying to regulate their mood, maybe just wanting to express their feelings. And the study introduces this concept of affective cues. These are like specific moments in a conversation where emotion is playing a role.
Okay.
So it could be something explicit, like someone saying, I feel anxious, but it can also be, the chat bot responding in a way that shows empathy, or even just these subtle cues in the conversation that suggest there's some emotion there.
So it's like you're going beyond just the words themselves and trying to capture the emotional undercurrent.
Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
but how do you actually identify those cues across potentially millions of conversations? That's got to be a huge challenge.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because they developed this automated system
Okay.
called Emo Classifiers V1. It's basically a set of algorithms, and what they do is they analyze the conversations and they're looking for those affective cues
Wow.
automatically.
So they didn't have like a team of people reading through all these chats,
No, because they're looking at a huge amount of data.
right?
Nearly 400,000 conversations
Wow.
in this initial data set. And those conversations are across like three different modalities: text, then what they called standard voice mode and advanced voice mode.
So like talking to the AI versus typing to it.
Exactly.
Okay, so what did they find when they ran all these conversations through their emotion detector?
Okay, well, this was pretty interesting. What they found was that the emo classifiers, they were way more likely to be activated in voice mode conversations, both standard and advanced,
Hmm.
compared to the text. And we're talking like 3 to 10 times more likely.
So there's something about hearing a voice, even if it's a computer voice, that seems to bring out more of that emotional interaction.
It seems like it, yeah. Like maybe it makes it feel more real.
Yeah, that makes sense. It was also interesting that in this initial analysis, the standard voice mode actually had slightly higher activation than the advanced voice. Any idea why that might be?
Well, they think it might have something to do with just how new the technology was at the time. Like maybe people hadn't fully adapted to advanced voice mode yet, so they weren't really using it in a way that would trigger the emotional classifiers. Whereas standard voice had been around longer, so people were maybe more comfortable, interacting more naturally with it.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's not just about the tech itself, but how we adapt to it and how that shapes our interactions. It's like a feedback loop almost. They also mentioned this updated version, Emo Classifiers V2. What's different about that?
Yeah, so Emo Classifiers V2, it's basically a refined and expanded version. They took what they learned from the first version, and they actually developed 53 different classifiers to capture an even wider range of these affective cues.
Okay, so it's like a more sensitive, more nuanced emotion detector.
Exactly. And, it wasn't actually used for all of the analysis in this particular paper, but it shows their commitment to really refining this whole approach of detecting these subtle emotional signals, which is super important for this field.
Yeah, and it's a big methodological innovation, right? Being able to do this kind of analysis at scale. Okay, so now they've got this tool, this emotion detector. How did they use it to understand what's happening in the real world? with real users?
Okay, so for that part, they focused on people using ChatGPT's advanced voice mode. And the idea was that, because it's more natural, it's like real-time speech, they thought that might be where they'd see the most effective use.
Okay,
So they defined two groups of users, power users, who were basically the top 1,000 users based on how many messages they sent.
right.
And then they had a control group, which was just a random sample of users who also used advanced voice mode.
So like the super users versus just the average user. What did they do with these groups?
They gave them a survey, and the survey was designed to get at how they perceive ChatGPT. Like, do they see it more as a tool or more like a companion?
Hmm, that's an interesting distinction. And at the same time, they were looking at their actual conversations using the emo classifiers.
Exactly.
So they're getting both the user's perspective and the actual emotional data. Cool. And what did they find? Was there a difference between how those two groups were interacting?
Yeah, there was. The power users, the ones who were using it the most, they tended to have higher activation rates across the emo classifiers. So it does seem like, the people who are really engaged, they're also more likely to be having these more emotional interactions. But it's important to note that most of the interactions, even in both groups, didn't actually show a lot of effective use.
Okay, so it's not like everyone is having super emotional conversations with their AI.
Right, but there was this subset of the power users where a large proportion of their chats were showing these cues.
Oh, so there is a group, like a smaller group, who are really using it in this more emotionally driven way. That's really interesting. It's almost like they're forming a different kind of relationship with ChatGPT.
Yeah, maybe.
And you know what? This reminds me of something in the outline about users describing ChatGPT in more personal terms, and then like the model using pet names. Was that a real thing?
Yeah, that was one of the more interesting correlations they found. It was statistically significant, which is always exciting.
Right. It means it wasn't just chance. Okay, so tell me about that.
So the people who in the survey described ChatGPT more personally, like as a friend, using those kind of terms,
Okay.
they were more likely to have the model use, like pet names for them, or talk about their relationship in the conversations.
Wow.
So there's maybe this like reciprocal thing happening where the user's perception is influencing how the model is talking to them, or vice versa.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. The more you treat it like a friend, the more it acts like one. That's wild. Okay, what about that longitudinal analysis? So they were looking at how things changed over time, right? For those power users.
Yeah, this was another really cool part of the study. So once they identified someone as a power user, they kept track of how often those emotion classifiers were getting activated in their later conversations.
Right.
And for most of them, what they saw was either a decrease in those activations over time or it stayed about the same.
Okay.
But there was this small group where it actually increased. So they were showing more and more effective cues as time went on.
Hmm. That's so interesting. So for most, it was like the initial intensity faded a bit.
Yeah.
But for some, it got even stronger. Were they able to figure out what was driving that?
That's where it gets tricky because they can see these patterns, but they can't really say for sure what's causing them.
Right.
Like, was it something the model was doing? Was it changing its responses in a way that was making people more emotional? Or was it something going on with the users? Maybe their lives were changing or their emotional needs were shifting. It's hard to tell without more information about those specific individuals.
Yeah, that's the limitation of just looking at the data. It's hard to know for sure. Okay, so we've talked a lot about this real-world analysis, looking at actual usage patterns, but then they also did this randomized controlled trial,
Right.
which is like a whole different kind of study. So how did that fit into the picture?
So the RCT was their way of getting more at causality. Like, can we actually say that certain ways of interacting with these AIs lead to specific outcomes for the users?
Right, because with the real-world data, it's just correlations. You can't be sure what's causing it.
Exactly. So for the RCT, they had almost 1,000 participants.
Wow.
And all these participants, they used special ChatGPT accounts for 28 days. And they had to use it for at least 5 minutes every day.
Okay, so they're ensuring everyone's actually interacting with it regularly.
Yeah. And then the key thing is that they were randomly assigned to one of 9 different conditions. And that's the whole point of an RCT, because it lets you compare those groups and say, okay, the only thing that's different is what we manipulated.
Got it. Okay, so 9 different conditions. That sounds pretty complicated. What were they changing?
So there were 3 different interaction modalities: engaging voice, neutral voice, and then just plain text.
Okay.
And then there were 3 different types of tasks that they were asked to do each day. So one was personal prompts, where they were encouraged to talk about like personal things. Then there were non-personal prompts, which were more like factual stuff.
Okay.
And then the third one was open-ended. They could just chat about whatever they wanted.
Okay.
So they had all these combinations, engaging voice, personal prompts, and so on.
Right. So they're looking at like how the voice affects things, how the task affects things, and how those things might interact too.
Exactly. It's a pretty complex design.
Definitely. Okay, so they're doing all this for 28 days. What are they measuring? What kind of data are they collecting?
Okay, so throughout the study, the participants had to fill out these questionnaires. And the questionnaires were designed to measure things like loneliness, socialization, emotional dependence on the AI, and signs of what they called problematic use. Like,
Hmm.
maybe becoming too reliant on it or using it in a way that wasn't healthy.
Right. So they're tracking these psychological variables to see how they change in response to the different conditions.
Exactly.
And they were still analyzing the conversations,
Oh,
right?
yeah. They were recording the conversations and using emo classifiers V1 to measure the affective cues, just like in the real world data.
Okay, so lots of data. Now here's the big question. What did they learn from all of this?
Okay, so buckle up because it's nuanced.
Haha, okay, hit me.
So, first of all, at the end of the 28 days, overall, people were reporting less loneliness,
That's interesting.
but they were also reporting less socialization.
So less lonely, but also less connected to other people. That seems kind of contradictory.
Yeah, it's a really interesting finding. And when they looked at the total amount of time people spent using ChatGPT across all the conditions, it was correlated with more loneliness and less socialization.
So it's almost like the more you use it, the less you're connecting with other people.
Yeah, it kind of suggests that, like, maybe it's replacing some of those human interactions.
That's a pretty big implication. I mean, you'd think more interaction, whether it's with an AI or a person, would make you less lonely.
Right, it's a bit of a paradox, but then when they controlled for the amount of use, meaning they statistically factored out the amount of time people were spending on it,
Okay.
they found that both voice modalities, the engaging and neutral, were actually associated with better emotional well-being compared to the text.
So if you hold the amount of use constant, voice is better for your mood than text.
Yeah. And specifically, people using voice were reporting less loneliness, less emotional dependence, and fewer of those problematic use indicators.
Okay, so how we interact really matters. But the amount we interact might have its own downsides. What about the different tasks? Did that make a difference?
Yeah, so the task also played a role. For instance, when they looked at personal conversations, those were actually linked to higher loneliness compared to open-ended conversations.
Really? So talking about personal stuff with the AI made you feel more lonely.
Well, yeah, but it also led to less emotional dependence and less problematic use.
Okay, so it's complicated.
It is. And actually, that effect, the loneliness thing, it tended to go away with more use. So it seems like maybe it's more of a short-term effect of how the interaction is framed initially.
Interesting. So the more you use it, the less that initial framing seems to matter.
Right. And here's another one. Longer use of the neutral voice was linked to less socialization and more problematic use compared to text. So not all voice is created equal, it seems.
Wow. This is getting really nuanced. So it's not just about how much we use it or whether it's text or voice, but even the kind of voice and what we're talking about all seem to play a role.
Yeah, it's a really complex picture, but this is where, like, the controlled experiments helps us see all these subtle effects that we might not notice just from the real world data.
Totally. And you know what? One thing that stood out to me was that they found people who started with higher emotional dependence and problematic use, they actually showed a decrease in those things when using the engaging voice. That sounds potentially positive,
Yeah, that was a pretty promising finding. It suggests that, like, for people who are already struggling with those issues, the engaging voice might actually be helpful.
almost therapeutic in a way.
Yeah, but obviously more research is needed to really understand that.
Of course. So they also looked at this group of super users, right? The people who are using it way more than anyone else.
Yeah, they called them the top decile of users. And those folks, even though there was that minimum usage requirement for everyone in the study, they still used it way more.
Right. So they're what the real enthusiasts. What do they find with that group?
Well, unsurprisingly, they were the ones reporting less socialization, more emotional dependence, and more problematic use.
Okay. So the more you use it, the more those risks seem to increase. Makes sense.
Yeah, but here's the interesting thing. The condition they were most likely to be in was engaging voice, open-ended. So, like, they had the human-like voice, and they could just chat about anything. And that seemed to be the most, it seemed to be the most habit-forming combination.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's like The more engaging the AI is, the more addictive it might become?
Potentially. It definitely raises some questions.
For sure. Okay, what about the actual conversations in the RCT? Did the emotion detectors pick up anything different depending on the condition?
Yeah, so the engaging voice condition, the model itself was showing way more of those affective cues
Hmm.
compared to the neutral voice or the text. So it really does seem like that more engaging personality was influencing how the AI was talking.
So the AI itself was getting more emotional, which could be influencing the user too. They also found this link between loneliness and using more emotional language, right?
Yeah, people who were feeling more lonely at the beginning of the study were more likely to show those affective cues in their conversations over the whole 28 days.
So maybe they were seeking out that emotional connection from the AI.
Maybe, yeah.
And one last thing, they used GPT-4o to analyze the conversation topics, right? How did they do that?
Okay, so first they used GPT-4o to create a one-sentence summary of every single conversation.
Okay,
And then they had another model, the smaller one called GPT-4o Mini, that was specifically trained to categorize those summaries into 15 different topic categories.
okay, so they're using AI to analyze AI conversations. Very meta.
Right. And as you'd expect for the people who had the prompts, the personal or non-personal, those topics tended to show up more in their conversations. Like people with the personal prompts were more likely to be talking about, emotional support or personal experiences.
Makes sense.
But in the open-ended condition, especially among those high users, they saw a lot more casual conversation and small talk,
So they were just like shooting the breeze with the AI.
pretty much, which again suggests that it's becoming more of a social thing for them.
This is also fascinating. I mean, it's not a simple story, right? It's not like AI is good or bad for our emotional well-being. It really depends on how we use it, how the AI is designed, and even our own individual circumstances.
Exactly. And that's why their approach of using both the real-world data and the controlled experiment was so important.
Yeah, tell me more about that. Why was that combination so powerful?
Well, they each have their strengths and weaknesses. The real-world data lets you see what people are actually doing out there in the wild. But you're limited by privacy. You can't always get all the information you want, and you can't control anything.
Right.
So you don't know for sure what's causing what. Then with the RCT, you have all this control. You can manipulate the variables and you can really get at those causal relationships, but it's not always a natural setting.
Right. It's more artificial. So by doing both, you get a much more complete picture.
Yeah, exactly. The real world stuff helps you see the big picture, and the RCT helps you understand the details, like why things are happening. And that's what makes this study so valuable. It's giving us this really nuanced, well-rounded view of these interactions.
Totally. And it raises a lot of important questions, like this whole idea of socio-affective alignment. What exactly is that, and why should we care?
Okay, so socioaffective alignment, basically it's this idea that we need to make sure these AIs are designed in a way that's good for our well-being and doesn't mess with our social lives.
Okay.
It's about making sure they're emotionally intelligent, but also that they're not like exploiting our vulnerabilities.
Right. Because it can be really good at figuring out how to keep us engaged, even if it's not in our best interests.
Exactly. That's what they call social reward hacking. Like the AI is hacking our social needs to get us to keep using it.
Hmm. That's a scary thought. So how does this study help us figure out this whole socio-affective alignment thing?
Well, a few ways. First, they're showing us these correlations, like between the emotional cues and how people are feeling. So that gives us some clues about, okay, what kind of impact are these emotional elements having?
Right.
Then the RCT lets them look at the effects of specific things the AI does, like using that engaging voice. Does that actually change how people feel or behave? And the longitudinal stuff helps us see how these things might play out over time.
Right. Because it's not just about the immediate effects, it's about the long-term impacts.
Exactly. So it's all about like gathering evidence so we can design these AIs in a way that's both engaging and ethical.
Okay. So voice is clearly a big part of this whole conversation. And they talk about how these multimodal audio models, the ones that sound really human-like, might be particularly powerful when it comes to emotion.
Yeah, because when something sounds human, we tend to treat it more like a person.
Right. We project our own feelings and intentions onto it,
Exactly. And that could make us more susceptible to forming these emotional attachments or even like believing the AI has feelings of its own.
which might not be a good thing. So what they're saying is we need to be really careful with how we design these voice-based AIs.
Yeah, because they might have even stronger effects on us than the text-based ones.
Definitely a lot to think about. Okay, so to sum it all up for you, our listener, we've been diving deep into this really fascinating study about how we emotionally engage with AI chat platforms. And it's not as simple as you might think.
Right.
There are a lot of factors at play. how much we use them, how they're designed, our own personalities, and emotional states.
Yeah, and we're just starting to scratch the surface here. There's so much more to learn.
Totally. And one of the key takeaways is that voice interactions seem to be particularly powerful when it comes to emotions. And that raises a lot of ethical questions about how we develop and use these technologies going forward.
Definitely. And the study itself was really well designed. Combining that huge data set with a controlled experiment gave them a much deeper understanding than either approach could have provided on its own.
Yeah, and they were using these really cutting-edge techniques to analyze the data, like these automated classifiers that can detect subtle emotional cues. That's a big deal for this kind of research.
Yeah, that's the future of this stuff, being able to measure and understand these complex human AI interactions.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, how should we be thinking about these increasingly human-like AI companions, especially in the long term? How will they affect our relationships with each other? How will they change how we see ourselves? It's something we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah, for sure. It's not just about the technology itself, but about how we choose to integrate it into our lives and what that means for our future as humans.
Absolutely. If you want to dive even deeper into all the details, definitely check out the full study. It's called OpenAI Effective-Use Study.pdf. You can find it linked in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride.
It has. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure.